All right. This is Joel, and I'm not the one who's going to do the class tonight, but my cousin Philip, who did the class last week, is going to speak again tonight. Now, Majola has asked him to take his time slot as well for this topic that he's speaking on tonight, and so the class will be around 40 minutes long instead of 20 minutes. So if you feel like it's running long, that's why. But it's a very important topic, and I think that the way Philip explains this can be very helpful to all of us. So let's pay attention, and if you have any questions, you can certainly ask those. I don't know if we'll be able to be online or not because we'll be out of town, but we'll try to be online. And if we're not able to, hopefully someone else can answer the questions, or we can try to handle those at a later time. Thanks a lot. Over to Philip.
All right, so my lesson for tonight is titled The Effects of Local Congregations Not Having Qualified Elders. And I want to go about this from really two directions. This could either be applied to a church that doesn't have elders at all, or what can sometimes even be worse is a church that has appointed elders, but the elders aren't really qualified, that biblically these men shouldn't be serving as elders and they're not really doing the work of elders. And in both cases, you can have a lot of challenges in a church. And so I want to look at that and talk about how difficult this is, but also talk about how we can overcome it, how I believe, even though God's design is for the local church to have elders, I believe that even when a church doesn't have elders, it can still be a thriving, growing church that's very pleasing to God. And I think there's ways that we can work through the issues of not having elders. Now, for me personally, I preach at a church that has two elders, two very good men who I'm very thankful for. But I've been at churches that did not have qualified elders. I've been at churches, I grew up in a church that didn't have elders at all. And I've been in other churches where the men who were serving as elders maybe shouldn't have been elders, or at least didn't understand what they should be doing as elders. And so I can see that all those things create challenges. But I think by the time we get to the end of this study, we'll be able to see a biblical path forward through some of these issues. So I want to start by just thinking about what is an elder. And the reason I start here is because a lot of times we misunderstand this, that what we think the role of an elder is not actually what the Bible emphasizes as being the role of an elder. And because of that, I think it can keep us from appointing elders, or cause us to appoint people as elders who shouldn't be elders, or cause a lot of other issues. So, first of all, a lot of times when we think about elders, we think about them as decision makers, someone who makes the decision about should we buy some new songbooks, or which songbooks should we buy, or what time should the church meet, or should we fix the roof on the church building, or those kinds of decisions. Sometimes bigger issues like should we invite this preacher to come preach for us, or should we not, or do we need to exercise some kind of church discipline over this member who's not faithful? So those kinds of decisions, there's a lot of different decisions, and sometimes we really focus on that if that's what the elder does, is the elders make decisions, and if only we had elders, decisions would be so much easier. Here's the thing. The Bible puts very little emphasis on this point. If you look at all the scriptures about elders, there's just not very much there about making decisions. Now, that's not to say that they don't make decisions. It's just that's maybe putting the emphasis in the wrong area. So let's fade that one out, and let's look at the next one. Shepherds. The Bible puts a big emphasis on elders being shepherds. So thinking of the church being like a flock of sheep, and the elders are the ones who are caring for those sheep. They're feeding them. They're looking out for the ones who are maybe going astray and kind of bringing them back. We're going to talk about this point quite a bit. The Bible also talks about elders as being teachers, someone who's out there teaching God's word, but also making sure that God's word is being taught, making sure there's not false teaching going on. And then finally, the Bible puts a big emphasis on elders just being mature Christians. Christians who are setting a good example to those around them because they've grown a lot and they know what it means to really follow Christ. And they've been through hard times, and other Christians can look up to them and see that that's what it looks like to follow Christ. So I really want to focus on these last three. But first, I want to do this. I want to mention what scriptures we need to look at when it comes to studying elders, because I think this is another area where I know I've sometimes focused on the wrong scriptures, as in missed some of the most important scriptures and focused on some that maybe weren't answering the question I was asking. So a lot of times we focus a lot on 1 Timothy 3, which is a great passage. It gives us the qualifications to elders, but it doesn't focus a lot on what the elders do. Although there are some things we could deduce from that, some things that we could see that the elder probably does because of those qualifications. But I want to move beyond just 1 Timothy 3. There's also Titus 1, which also gives the qualifications, and we will be talking some about Titus 1. But Acts 20, we won't be looking at Acts 20 today, but if you want to really study what elders do, I think Acts 20 is very helpful, where Paul talks about his example of how he taught people and how he cared for the church. And then he talks to the elders, and he seems to compare the work he was doing to the work that the elders are doing, and really showing how the elders need to be caring for the church. 1 Peter 5 emphasizes the shepherd aspect, that shepherds need to be feeding the flock, caring for the flock. And then here's the one that's maybe not looked at as often because it's in the Old Testament, but Ezekiel 34 is a really interesting passage. It is in the Old Testament, so it's not talking about elders as we have them today. But with each of these kinds of topics, the Old Testament gives us, I think of it as the roots. The New Testament gives us the tree, the Old Testament gives us the roots of the tree. And so in Ezekiel 34, God's talking to Israel's leaders, but he uses the term shepherd to talk about them. And you can see how the shepherds in the Old Testament, the leaders in the Old Testament, were kind of like the precursor, what came before the elders in the New Testament. And so you can see a lot of the ways that the elders in the Old Testament should have been living, and they weren't living that way, but how they should have been living. And we can see that that's how God wants his leaders in the New Testament to be living. All right, and that's actually where we're going to start here. Let's talk about the dangers of not having qualified elders. What could it potentially do to a church? Now, it doesn't mean that this is going to happen in a church without elders, but it often does happen in a church without elders. These dangers often could also happen in a church where you have men as elders, but they're either not qualified to be elders or they really don't understand what they're supposed to be doing. So the way I want to do this is by looking at that passage in Ezekiel, because in this passage, God really explains to Israel, here's the problem. Your shepherds aren't being shepherds. And so you have a situation with basically no shepherds. And so here's what he says, starting in verse 1. And the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, Thus says the Lord God to the shepherds, Woe to the shepherds of Israel who feed themselves. Should not the shepherds feed the flock? All right, let's think about this a little bit here. The problem is that the shepherds are feeding themselves. So they're in it selfishly. They think that being a shepherd, being an elder, means all about serving themselves. Instead, they need to be feeding the flock. This shows us what happens when you don't have qualified elders, but it also shows you what you should be having, if you do have qualified elders, elders should be feeding the church, feeding them spiritually. So that would be the teaching, that would be the providing the spiritual bread that they need. It says, you eat the fat and clothe yourselves with the wool. You slaughter the fatlings, but you do not feed the flock. So that's showing us again that there's a lack of feeding going on. The weak you have not strengthened. All right, now this one's really helpful too. Weak you have not strengthened. So something elders should be doing is strengthening people who are weak. So you think about someone who's just spiritually weak. Maybe they're falling into sin. Maybe they just don't understand what they need to be doing in a Christian life very well. And the elders need to be strengthening them. So they need to find out who's weak in this congregation and be figuring out what can we do to give them some extra strength. He goes on to say, nor have you healed those who are sick. Now, again, I'm going to apply this spiritually, that there may be some people who are spiritually sick, and the shepherds should be healing them, should be helping them overcome those sins that they're struggling with. Nor bound up the broken. So here, he's saying you haven't bound up let's say someone's injured. If a sheep is injured, you put a bandage on it and you help them to recover. What if someone's spiritually injured? What if somebody has fallen into sin? Are you going to help them recover from that sin? Help them do what's right the next time. Help them seek forgiveness from God. Nor have you brought back what was driven away. So go and find that sheep that's wandered away. I think about Jesus' parable of the shepherd going out and finding that one sheep, leaving the 99 to go out to find that one sheep that was lost. That's what elders should do. An elder should see that, hey, there's a sheep who's not following Christ anymore, or maybe they haven't worshiped with us in a long time. I'm going to go visit that person. I'm going to go talk to that person. I'm going to figure out what I can do to try to help bring them back. Nor sought what was lost. Same idea. In fact, the wording is so similar to what you have with Jesus, the going to find that one sheep that was lost. But then he's saying, here's what these elders are doing instead. But with force and cruelty you have ruled them, so they were scattered because there was no shepherd. All right, scattered. He says that these sheep here, when there aren't good shepherds for these sheep, the sheep end up scattered. Now, unfortunately, a lot of churches can be like that, where members are falling away and nobody's doing anything about it. A church is kind of scattering. People are falling into sin and they're being lost, and no one's there to help them. That's a big problem. And then he says, and they became food for all the beasts of the field when they were scattered. So they become food for the beasts. That makes me think of Jesus talking about the wolves, the savage wolves coming in. In fact, that Acts 20 passage, Paul uses that terminology to talk to the elders. He says that after he departs, there will be savage wolves among them. Elders should be dealing with that. Shepherds in a church need to be identifying who are wolves and trying to protect the flock from those wolves. Verse 6, my sheep wandered through all the mountains and on every high hill. Yes, my flock was scattered over the whole face of the earth, and no one was seeking or searching for them. So I think this passage just gives us a really helpful picture of what an elder should be. They need to be someone who really cares about God's people, and who really cares about how every single Christian is doing spiritually. And they're particularly concerned about those who are weak and struggling. And they're going to go and they're going to help each one of those weak, struggling Christians. All right, well, let's go on. Now that we've seen, here's what this church could look like. If you don't have elders, sometimes you have a lot of Christians who are weak and struggling and nobody's helping them. But now let's start thinking biblically. Let's look more at the positive. What are some New Testament passages that tell us what elders should be doing and what elders are? And I want to do this because I think if we can really understand this, we're going to find what God's solution is to churches that don't have elders, what God says we can do in that situation. So we looked at these 4 different areas with elders, particularly focusing on these last 3. Let's go through and let's talk about each of them. Let's start with the shepherds, because again, I don't want to focus on the decision makers right now. Let's look at elders as shepherds. A key passage about this is 1 Peter 5. The elders who are among you, I exhort, I who am a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that will be revealed, shepherd the flock of God which is among you. So here he uses the term shepherd. And we've got all of that Old Testament background. When Peter uses the word shepherd, we don't have to wonder what he means by that. We know what that meant in the Old Testament. We know Peter's building on all of that Old Testament language. Shepherd the flock of God which is among you, serving as overseers, not by compulsion, but willingly, not for dishonest gain, but eagerly. You can see how this passage really builds on the Ezekiel passage, because those shepherds in the Old Testament were selfish. They were doing it for dishonest gain. They were doing it so they could eat the sheep, was the way it was described. And so Peter's saying, don't be like that. It's not about what you get out of it. It's about serving. Verse 3, nor as being lords over those entrusted to you. Elders are not kings. They're not people who sit on some big throne and tell people what to do. He says instead, they are to be examples, being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that does not fade away. I like that he mentions the chief shepherd here. That's Jesus. And he's bringing up Jesus to say Jesus is our model shepherd. If we want to know what I should be, what someone should be as an elder, they should be like Jesus. And so he's saying it's not about lording over people. It's about setting an example, being a mature Christian that other Christians look up to, and they follow the kind of life you're leading. Well, let's move on to the next one. Let's talk about teachers. And this one, I've just got just one verse here, so we'll hit this one a little faster. But the elders are also commanded to be teaching. And this fits right into what we saw in Ezekiel with feeding the flock. And so in Titus 1, verse 9, Paul tells us that he's describing elders here, and he says, holding fast the faithful word as has been taught. So one thing is they need to hold on to it. Don't let go of the gospel. That he may be able, by sound doctrine, so doctrine that's true, that's the word of God, that's not perverted at all, that he may be able, by sound doctrine, both to exhort and convict those who contradict. Exhort and convict. So that's teaching there. That's teaching it positively. That's also teaching it negatively and saying, no, that's wrong. Don't say that. That's not what the truth is. So elders need to be having a teaching kind of role in a church. Now, that doesn't mean they're the only teachers, and we're going to talk about that more here in a bit. And it doesn't mean that they're doing all of the teaching. A lot of what they do might just be making sure that the right things are taught, but they will be in a teaching kind of role. All right, so now let's hit the last one, mature Christians. And this is a big one. This one takes us back to 1 Timothy chapter 3 and also Titus 1, where he talks about the qualifications for elders. I want to look at this Titus 1 passage, and then I want to show how it fits into the rest of the book of Titus. So in Titus chapter 1, in verse 5, Paul says, "For this reason I left you in Crete, that you should set in order the things that are lacking, and appoint elders in every city as I commanded you. If a man is blameless, the husband of one wife, having faithful children, not accused of dissipation or insubordination." All right, let's just think through a few of those. So blameless, someone who you don't have a lot of bad things to say about them. They seem like a good Christian person. Not that they're perfect, but they're someone who's a good Christian example. They have a good family. So someone who's been a Christian long enough that you can look at them and say, yeah, they're living the Christian life. They're raising a good family. Verse 7, "For a bishop must be blameless, as a steward of God, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but hospitable, a lover of what is good, sober-minded, holy, just, self-controlled, holding fast the faithful word as he has been taught, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and to convict those who contradict." So he's just, you think through these different things. These are things that every Christian should be working towards. None of us should be greedy. All of us should be hospitable. All of us should be inviting people over and spending time with other Christians. All of us should love what's good. And you can go through each of these and think these are just the marks of a Christian who's mature, who's grown a lot spiritually and overcome a lot of sins. Not that they're perfect, but they're definitely headed in the right direction, and they've definitely come a long ways. Now, let's think through it like this. The way the book of Titus is written is really interesting. Titus starts out, as Paul's writing to Titus, Paul starts out by telling Titus there needs to be elders in each city. And then he tells Titus about the kind of character that these elders should have. That's at the beginning of Titus 1. Then at the end of Titus 1, and we're not going to look at this, but at the end of Titus 1, he talks about why this is so important. And he talks about how there's a lot of people out there who are not teaching the truth. People who are just living a self-centered life. And he shows how that was the culture there in Crete. That's just the way people were in the world there. And he doesn't want Christians to be that way. So you can see this connection between, let's appoint some leaders in the church who are mature Christians, and that's going to help us with the problem that there's a lot of really immature, worldly Christians in that church, or at least influencing the church. But then as you continue on, once you get into the beginning of chapter 2, he tells us what all the Christians should be like. And what's so interesting to me is as he goes through and he talks about older men, older women, younger women, as he talks about each of these, he uses terminology that's very similar to what he talked about with elders. So let's look at this Titus 2 passage, and let's see all the connections between what he said about the elders and what he says about all Christians. So in Titus chapter 2, verse 1, it says, "But as for you, speak the things which are proper for sound doctrine." So Titus needs to be focusing on sound doctrine. Now that connects me back to Titus 1, verse 9, where he talked about elders teaching sound doctrine. Now he goes on, he says that the older men be sober, reverent, temperate, sound in faith, in love, in patience. All right, so we've got some terms that are kind of similar. You've got things like where he talks about being sound in faith is similar to our sound in doctrine. He talks about the reverence and the temperance, which seem very similar to what we had with being blameless and not quick-tempered and those kinds of things. But as we keep going here, he says, verse 3, the older women likewise, that they may be reverent in behavior, not slanderers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things. All right, not given to much wine. You notice how that compares to what we had with the elders, how they're supposed to be, let me see, where was it? That they're supposed to be blameless, stewards of good, and not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not given to wine. There we go. And so you have the older women are not to be given to much wine. The elders are not supposed to be given to wine. Teachers of good things, that the women are supposed to be teaching what's good, just like how we had the elders need to be exhorting and convicting people. So that the women need to be teaching and the elders need to be teaching as well. Verse 4, that they may admonish the young women to love their husbands, to love their children. And so here, there's this focus on family here, which is very similar to the elder. We've got a big emphasis on the family, the children, the wife. So there, it seems very similar, although now it's talking in terms of the wife's role in that. Verse 5, to be discreet, chaste, homemakers, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be blasphemed. Verse 6, likewise, exhort the young men to be sober-minded. Sober-minded. We've got sober-minded over here for the elders as well. In all things, showing yourself to be a pattern of good works. So being a pattern of good works, it seems very similar to how the elders should be leading by example. In doctrine, showing integrity, reverence, in incorruptibility, sound speech that cannot be condemned, that one who is an opponent may be ashamed, having nothing evil to say of you. Nothing evil to say of you. It's very similar to blameless. How an elder, there's nothing you can say against them. I mean, you can make something up about anybody, but you just look at their behavior and you see they're a good person. There's just not a lot you could say bad about them. And here he's saying the same thing about these other Christians as well, that they need to have it where there's just nothing evil you're going to say about this person because they're just living a good moral life. All right, I wanted to really focus on that because I think it helps us with this big question now. What should we do if we don't have elders in a congregation? So if we're in a church where there's nobody who's currently qualified to be an elder, how do we function? What do we do? How do we function as a church when we don't have anyone fulfilling that role? Here's what I think God's design is. We talked about these 4 different roles of elders, although we haven't really talked about the decision-making yet. I believe the Bible shows us that everyone should be doing this kind of work. Now, we'll all do it a little bit differently because you notice there when he talked about the older women, they need to be teaching the younger women. Just like how elders teach, the older women need to be teaching, but not in the same way. They're supposed to be focusing on teaching the young women. So we won't be doing exactly the same work as the elder, not all of us in exactly the same ways, but did you see how much overlap there is? That all Christians need to be serving and helping in those kinds of ways. You think about as shepherds, that what shepherds meant was it's feeding the flock and it's going to find that one sheep that's gone astray. Isn't that something that every Christian should be doing? That if a sheep is wandering off, shouldn't we all want to go help them? When Jesus gave that parable about the shepherd leaving the 99 to go find that one sheep that's lost, he meant that as an example for all of us. All of us need to have that kind of heart, that if we see someone who's falling into sin, we're there helping them. When you think about teachers, think about how many scriptures there are that talk about lots of people being teachers. You remember in Hebrews when the Hebrew writer says how by this time you ought to be teachers. He's talking to Christians in general there, that all of us need to be teaching in some way. Now, not all of us are going to be up there teaching in front of the whole church, but all of us will be teaching in some way, maybe just one-on-one or just teaching a friend or a neighbor. That's something that all of us need to be working on. And then, of course, being a mature Christian, all of us need to be growing to maturity. If we've been Christians a long time and we're still really immature in the way we act and the way we think, then we haven't grown the way Christ wants us to grow. All of us need to be developing that. So what I see as God's model here is that even when there aren't elders who are officially serving in that role of elder, all of us need to be fulfilling those roles. And we need to have churches that have a culture of that, where they don't just sit there, people aren't just sitting there waiting for somebody else to do it. We're developing a culture where somebody sees a sheep going astray and they personally go and talk to that person and help that person. Someone sees someone who needs to be taught and they, instead of waiting for someone else to do the teaching, they go do the teaching. Rather than having to be pushed to grow to maturity, Christians are eager to grow to maturity. Now, I understand this doesn't happen a lot of times, but this is God's design. This is what we need to be developing as a church. But that brings us to the last one. What about decision makers? And this is the challenge, because a lot of times in a church that doesn't have elders, this becomes the big issue, that it feels like there's nobody there making the decisions. Or maybe too many people are trying to make the decisions and it becomes a big argument and, well, I want it my way and you want it your way and how are we going to work this out? And you feel like if you just had an elder there to stand up and say, it's going to be this way, it would make everything so much easier. But I'm not sure that that's the right answer. Elders are to be overseers, which means they will make decisions. But did you notice that's not the big emphasis of what elders do? The big emphasis is on shepherding and teaching and setting an example of maturity. So when we're in those situations where we really need to be making decisions and we don't have the elder just to point to and just say, oh, he's going to do it for us, how do we handle it? I think what really makes a lot of sense from God's word is that if we are all working to be mature Christians, then that's going to help us with the decision making. That if you have a church where people are trying to think maturely like Christians, that they're growing as Christians, then as we discuss things together, the decision making is not going to be so painful. It's going to be something where we can work together and we can come to an answer on this. And that younger Christians who are not as mature are letting the Christians who are more mature step up and make those decisions. That they're recognizing that those who have that maturity need to be taking a lead on these things. Now, it is going to be more difficult because you won't have the official role of someone who everybody recognizes as an elder. But if we can be a church that's really reaching for maturity, then we can work through those things in love. That's God's design. Now, I understand this is one of those things that's definitely much easier said than done. But I believe from the scriptures, God's design for churches that don't have elders is that all of us will be working on those different roles. And what that does, one thing it does is it allows a church to be very strong and to be really growing, even without elders as leaders yet. But it will also create an environment where you will have elders at some point. Because if everybody's working to develop these characteristics, then when it comes time to appoint elders, you look around and you'll see people who are already doing that work. You'll see people who are already shepherding the flock. And so who will you appoint as an elder? Well, the person who's already seems to be a shepherd. They already care about the sheep. When they are appointed as elders, they're not going to have to wonder now, what does it mean to shepherd a flock? They've already been doing that work for a long time. But here's the last part of this. Sometimes we can have churches that do have elders, and all the rest of the members of the church are just pointing to the elders and saying, they'll do it. We don't have to do it, they'll do it. And I think sometimes that can be one of the worst situations of all. That at that point, none of the Christians are growing. They're just expecting the elders to do all the growing. That's not the way God designed the church. Even in a church that has elders, everyone needs to be going and seeking after that sheep that went astray. Everyone needs to be growing where they can teach other people. Everybody needs to be growing to maturity. And so I want to end with this thought. When it comes to elders, when it comes to this topic of churches not having qualified elders, let's start by understanding what the work of an elder is. Let's start there, correcting all those misunderstandings that congregations have of what an elder actually is. Oh, they're not kings, they're not rulers, they're shepherds. But then, let's not stop there. Let's all pursue that kind of work. Let's all, in different ways, whatever our abilities are and whatever roles God's given us, let's pursue those kinds of actions. Let's be seeking out the sheep that are lost. Let's be helping. Let's be serving. Let's be growing to maturity. Let's all pursue the work of elders. And by doing that, I think we can, through God's grace, God's help, following God's design, we can not only be a strong church without elders, but we can someday be ready to appoint those elders and continue to grow to maturity. All right, I hope this was helpful for all of us. Thank you.